Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first of our Graphic Design for Libraries webinar series. This is Elements of Design. My name is Courtney Allison, and I'm the Southeast Regional Coordinator from the Indiana State Library's Professional Development Office. I'll be the host and question moderator today. Our presenter this morning is Matthew Stephenson from Pendleton Community Public Library. I'd like to start off the webinar with a few announcements. This is the first webinar in this three-part series. To register for other webinars available for this theme or for other trainings available from the Professional Development Office, please see the Indiana State Library's events calendar, which can be found at our website, www.in.gov/library. For a full list of our current in-person training menu, please see our continuing education website. The Indiana State Library has many ways we try to stay connected to library staff across the state. For weekly updates on upcoming trainings and to learn more about what's happening in libraries across the state, please subscribe to our e-newsletter, The Wednesday Word. We also offer a blog which provides information about the Indiana State Collection, interview spotlights on library staff from across the state, and information about upcoming events at the Indiana State Library. If you have a question, just type it in the chat box on the upper left side of the screen, and Matthew and I will be watching that box. We'll get your question answered as soon as there's a good opportunity. There should also be time near the end for questions. The session is 1 hour, so you'll get one LEU for today. At the end of this presentation, I'll put a link on the screen for you to download your LEU, so please stay signed in until the end of the presentation to get your LEU. I'll also put a link in the chat box to a survey about this presentation. Please, please, please take the survey and let us know how we're doing. If at any point during the webinar you experience any sound issues, please see the sound issues box just below the chat box on the left side of the screen. If there's a global sound issue, we will announce it in the chat pod. If you are unable to resolve the sound issues you're experiencing, we are recording the meeting and you can watch it after it's ended. Again, if there's a global sound issue, we will make an announcement in the chat box. So now I'm going to turn it over to Matthew.
Hello everyone. Usually I'm like manic and when I do presentations, so I don't know how well this is going to come off on a webinar, but usually I'm like a wacky inflatable flailing armed tube man. So I've had a lot of coffee this morning, so that might come through the presentation as well. I'm not going to go full screen because I'm going to be going back and forth between my presentation and places on the internet. So it's just easier for me to go back and forth that way. But you are all here for Elements of Design, which is, we're talking about the most basic elements of graphic design and design in general. So these are things like color, texture, contrast, things that you typically might not even be aware of when you're creating something for your library. But these things, now that we have social media and that we obviously have websites for each of our libraries, these are things that we have to be conscious of because this is what our patrons are viewing. This is what they're subconsciously viewing as things that we might be aware of how we're organizing our information on our flyers and on our brochures. So this is more of a session to just let you be aware of what you might not even necessarily know what you're doing when you're watching or when you're making something. So let's see here. Come on. There we go. Okay. So in this hour, we're going to cover the foundational elements of design. These are things like color, texture, space, contrast, and then fonts and resolution. We're going to talk about, they're not necessarily elements, but because fonts are kind of like texture and contrast, and they absorb all the different other elements of design. And then we're going to talk about resolution and aspect ratio because over the years of going into different public libraries and academic libraries, I've noticed that a lot of people don't take into the fact that resolution and aspect ratio, when they make something on their computer and then they put it on a screen or a piece of paper, they kind of either stretch the image or shrink the image, or and then it doesn't look good. So we're going to look at, like, I'm going to give you some examples of what happens when you take a design that's meant for a letter size paper and you stretch it onto a 16 by 9 HD TV, so that you are aware of what happens and why it's not good and why you have to put a little bit of extra work into making something look correct. Um, but like I said, or like Courtney said, I will answer questions, so don't be afraid to put in chat. Usually when I'm doing this in person, I'm always like, raise your hand, just like interrupt me. Don't worry. So I will answer questions as best as I can throughout this hour. So our first design element is color. And color is, personally, this is the most important element of design. Because graphic design is not easy. You have to have some creativity, and more than creativity, you have to have attention to detail. So we are all jacks of all trades. We all have multiple job functions. We have job responsibilities. Sometimes it's hard to get like 30 minutes here, 30 minutes there to sit down and actually focus on what we're creating for our library, for our patrons. And so color is like the first thing you can do to really kind of step up your game, is understanding why certain colors work in our brain versus other colors. And so colors are reflections of brands. I'm going to show you an infographic here in a little bit that explains the color trends that we see in day-to-day life, because we're all inundated with brands, with, I was talking yesterday about Nike and McDonald's, and you have these corporations that have very recognizable brands, but they, on top of that, they are more associated with colors than maybe necessarily shapes. So it's the most recognizable element in design. It's amazing how you could give somebody the exact red and the exact yellow. You show it to somebody, go, what brand uses these colors, and they'll immediately say McDonald's. And then we'll also talk about how you can reuse colors from your logo and promotional materials, because the library is a brand. It's a brand in your community. It's not a nationwide brand, but it is a brand nonetheless for your community. And so using those colors throughout your promotional materials to kind of as an underlying a tying element between your brochure and your flyers and any sort of special designs that you might make, that can be an important underlying element to everything. So this infographic I've always found is interesting, because we don't necessarily think about it unless you're like an uber nerd like me and you really pay attention to this kind of stuff. But so this infographic, it might be a little out of date, but it still kind of demonstrates my point, which is that brands typically stay away from certain colors. So here we have blue, red, yellow, and then gray or black, and that you see those percentages there. And then when you think about, well, there are color, you have like red and yellow. Well, MasterCard uses red and yellow. McDonald's uses red and yellow. Shell uses red and yellow. But it is kind of interesting that 33% of the top 100 brands, according to brand value, use blue. It's an important color. It's the sea. It's the sky. It's it's the first color that we really associate with something. But what's fascinating here is blue, red, and yellow are like foundational colors. Those are the colors that we associate with when we make colors. Especially red and yellow. We don't have green there, but these are the colors that we think about. 95% of, and if you notice here, 95% of brands, of these top 100 brands, use one or two colors. Now, some of us have not been blessed with a library logo that has only one or two colors. Sometimes we have, a rainbow of colors. My particular library, we have brown and orange, which are not necessarily the most attractive colors. They work well in the context of the library, but they're not very attractive to maybe people who are outside the community or just recently moved to the community. Um, and they brown and yellow don't necessarily, or brown and orange don't necessarily work very well together. Um, so we've kind of rebranded ourselves in the last year, um, utilizing. We still have the same logo, but we've utilized red and gray, which are much more, as you can see here. Red and gray are colors that are backbones of these brands. Um, this is noticeable here. So these colors, as you can see, like Target and Starbucks, FedEx. Um, I was thinking about Google. You could show the four colors of Google, and people recognize it right away. Even the green, which is part of the point of the Google logo. But these colors are associated with a brand. So look at like the Chanel logo. It's just black. Black kind of is elegant. It's stately. Um, there's colors that are reliable, that people feel reliable towards. Um, so take note of the color, and more importantly, take note of what colors balance each other out. So we have complementary colors, which we'll talk about later in contrast. But um, this color scheme here, like triadic, are very good. They're harmonious colors that work well together. Analogous colors are, they sometimes work well together, sometimes they don't. But monochromatic is the one color that it's that clean, elegant, balanced. So whatever color you choose, kind of try to maybe stick with a little bit of that color. So um, we'll we'll get a little bit later and talk. Well, let me show you real quick about color. So in case if you've ever wondered what what exact colors you use, you might not have a brand materials. At our library, we have specific brand guidelines based on our logo, so we can't utilize certain colors inside the logo, except in the case of like you take the logo and you just make it black and white. But you can use this website, Color Code Picker, if you're not necessarily skilled at picking up colors, and you need to get color off of a image that you already have. You can go to colorcodepicker.com. You can choose a file. So here I have our library's logo, and then I upload it, and it comes up, and I can click anywhere, and it's going to give me the color codes that are necessary for that color. So in our case, the orange that we have is this RGB code. So 231 is red, 150 is green, and 26 is blue. Then we have this hex code. This hex code is what is used for websites. So in case if you can do this with, you can pull these colors with paint even, if you know how to do it. But unless you know what you're doing with GIMP or with Paint or with any image editor, you might not have a way of grabbing those colors or knowing how to grab those colors. This is a good website to find that. It's very easy. You just find a color, you click on it, and it tells you exactly that color code. I typically work with hex codes. I'll explain why next week. The website is colorcodepicker.com. I don't know if our chat will allow us to type in a link. There we go. So colorcodepicker.com. It's an easy, clean website to use. Now, if you're working on website, because one thing I'm going to talk about is utilizing ideas in design from things that we see in culture. If you are scouring the internet and you see a color scheme that you really like, you can use this this extension in Chrome. It's called Colorzilla. If you go to Google, you type in Colorzilla, it's going to come right up. It's a tool. It looks like an eyedropper up here on my Chrome bar up here. And so if I go to any website, say I have this tweet button, I want to find out what that blue is. I click this eyedropper. I move my crosshairs right over. As soon as I click, it's going to copy the color code that I need. And if I go to, say, my notepad, or if I go anywhere, I can paste in that color code anywhere I go. You don't necessarily have to click. You can just use this color picker, and you can see the color code up at the top of this screen. So here, like this green is 92, 255, 113, and then it gives me the hex code 5CFF71. I have some other options, like right now the point sample is right at the point of that crosshair is what that color is. If I do like an 11 by 11 average, it's going to choose a 11 by 11 pixel area, and it's going to give me the average of those colors. So that is good for when you have a gradient, like here in this bar from here to here, there's a gradient. So there's gray right here, but it's white up here. If I choose an area, it's going to give me the average color for that area. So that way you're not wondering what the color is. You don't have to get it exact. It's just going to give you an idea of what that color spot is. Now, some of us don't have necessarily the best eye for color. If you don't want to take a lot of time, like, so here's a website called PaletteIn. This is a good way to find your complementary colors, well, we can do tetrad colors, we can do triad colors. Once you pull in a color code, you can paste it into down here in this RGB code. So I'm pasting that blue that I copied from earlier, and it's going to give me a palette to work from. Now this palette is going to show me like what colors work together. So here I've chosen adjacent colors. So these are the adjacent colors. It shows you right on the color wheel where they are located. So here's my monochromatic. So these are blues that work well with the blue I've chosen. If I'm going with a monochromatic color scheme, if I want an adjacent color scheme, I get a green, then some light blue, and then a dark blue to go with it. If I go with a triad, you'll notice that I get a blue and then an orange and a red. It's all more like a dark orange than a red. But so these are, if you are maybe not the best with colors, this is a good way to kind of get an idea or a feel for colors. Tetrad, so you're going to get some more oranges. So here you've noticed that we've gone from like a dark orange to a more moderate oranges here. And then you could do freestyle, but this is like, ooh, you really should probably know where you're going with that. That's if you're really wanting to kind of poke around and have a whole lot of time to play around with it. Real quick, but if you're short on time, and this is one thing I've tried to emphasize in this presentation, is if you're short on time, because we are all short on time, this website, it's coolors.co. So it's COOLORS.co, is a color generator. So it's going to generate a color scheme for you. Takes a little bit of time. You can watch a tutorial. I don't need to watch a tutorial, but so it's going to give us color names as well. If you need to ever maybe go to, maybe you're going to repaint your library. That is an element that or a design that you're making in your libraries if you ever decide to do a mural or you decide to paint your library in a certain color. Um, that's if you're an administrator or you have the ability to do that and have the say to do that. But here I can edit any of these codes. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to paste in that color code that I have from earlier. So here I have bright cerulean. I've never been able to say that word, but so here, this is the color that I picked from Twitter. What I'm able to do is if I press this lock, it locks that color in so that every time I hit the space bar, it's going to generate a color scheme based off of that color. So the idea is that you can create a color palette 5 colors deep. You don't have to. You can use it to just kind of get 3 colors. How you do this is you look at it. Don't necessarily pay attention to this magic mint, this jungle green, this pastel green. Look at the color adjacent to it and see if you get a color that you like. Every time you hit space, it's going to generate a color that should work. So here, I like this charcoal. I lock the charcoal. Next time I hit space, and now it's going to generate a palette based on the blue that we initially chose and the charcoal. So now we have Tuscany. So now you notice that we're starting to get different colors as we go along. So we have a purple. So you don't have to utilize all 5 colors. You can just utilize 1, 2, or 3 colors. But this is a good shorthand to try to find out what colors work well together. That pretty much covers color at this point. This is a tool I use, I think, almost every time I make a flyer or any sort of design or a logo. I always try to utilize this website because it's always a good refresher, because sometimes I think I get a little dark. I've always had people notice that like my flyers are dark. I tend to use a lot of dark colors. This kind of brings me back into working with some brighter colors than normal. I started using more yellows and purples and colors that I typically shied away from because of this website. That brings me to texture. Texture is probably the hardest element of design to get a handle on. It's a design principle that has been after the launch of the iPhone, texture was something that kind of went away from common or shared culture because the iPhone made everything clean. You wanted everything to be clean. So if you notice, like the apps that you use tend to use clean colors. They don't have gradients. They don't have texture to them. They're very clean and monochromatic. And the reason is texture. Like Suzanne says in chat, texture can be done really badly if you don't know what you're doing with it. So it is by far my weakest element when I design things. I try to stay more away from it, even though it is making kind of a comeback in our design. It is very, very hard to do without certain skills. It's difficult to achieve. So you can utilize different kinds of textures in your design. So natural textures would be water, sand, things that you see in nature, grass. Man-made textures would be like concrete, like we saw in this previous photo. So we have concrete here, or cloth, or rubber, things that man make. And then virtual sources. So virtual sources would be, if you've ever seen the movie The Matrix, you have the green text that falls down. It's got that kind of virtual texture to it. It's got depth to it. But it's not anything common or made by hand. It's something that you can only really create with a computer screen. So texture can be done really, when it's done well, it's amazing. When it's done poorly, it's really noticeable. So here is a nice example that I saw. You can see how The paint looks very liquid, looks very like a pool of liquid, and but it's kind of viscous. It's not like water. It's got some weight to it. This I always like this one because it shows you what a monochromatic, what the picture of the Japanese flag would look like, and this is what it looks like when it's like crumpled paper. And also you can see the depth. It looks like it's got that translucent feel to it on the left hand side. It's kind of pokes through, but it's giving you depth. It's giving you texture as well. This is a flyer that I did 3 years ago for James Alexander Tom. He came and spoke at our library. Not my greatest flyer I've ever made because it's crammed full of information. We're going to talk about space here in a little bit. But I tried to emphasize his features and with texture. So I was able to take a photo of him and basically develop it into a drawing because I wanted to emphasize his kind of grandfatherly, almost like Santa Claus features. So I wanted to emphasize his wisdom, kind of with the wrinkles in his face and that kind of thing, because it was very hard to find a picture of the man, but that I liked. But I wanted to emphasize certain elements of his face. Space is by far, if texture is the most difficult design element, space is the most difficult specifically for librarians. And here's why. We like to share information. We want to tell everything there is to know about anything. We want to tell people, so if I'm thinking about a flyer, for instance, a flyer, people want to know the time. They want to know the date. We need to put down RSVP information. We need to tell who the presenter is, what kind of activities there are, if there are age restrictions, if there are, if you need to go to the circulation desk to sign up, or if you can do it online. We need to put where the library is and our website, and we put a lot of stuff on our flyers. I am guilty of this. We are all guilty of this. When we think of brands and we think of things that get put on, when we go to, say, if you go to like a public place, or you go someplace and you look at the bulletin board, you'll notice that like you don't typically see it with bands, but you do see it with a lot of different smaller events. We don't want to inundate people with information where they can't process the information that we put on it. So if we have just a bunch of text on a flyer, nobody's going to read it because nobody wants to sit there and read a novel. Sometimes we have to let the design tell the story rather than the text, okay? So here, this is obviously showing you on the left-hand side, this is what nice space looks like. On the right-hand side, this is telling you way too much information, okay? We love telling people as much as we can, but sometimes we need to kind of rein it back. So a cluttered design is like, well, I made a mistake here. I gotta fix it because I am horrible. A cluttered design is like a cluttered desk. I am the worst at cluttered desk. My coworker is in chat or is watching this right now. I am sorry for my desk situation. My desk is like cluttered all to heck. But I try to. But if you were to look at my computer, I try to keep everything very clean. So if somebody were to sit at my computer and they were needing to get to whatever a design I've made or a document I have, they can get to it. Okay, that they know exactly how it works. We need to understand that negative space is incredibly important. That there needs to be quote unquote white space. That there needs to be space. It doesn't necessarily have to be white. It just needs to be space in between words, between elements of the design itself. That space is important for people to process what is going on. So here is an element of, this is more just like understanding, they didn't change the wording here at all. It's the mountains are yearning and I must go. But by simply closing in or magnifying over here versus pulling out the photo over here, you can obviously see that there's a lot more white space here around the words. Okay, so sometimes the images you use can really be more about the space than necessarily the size of the words that you use. Okay. Notice here, this is a nice element or a nice example that I found last year or 2 years ago. So over here we have Keene State College Department of Music presents, but you see how they use the negative space into the design here. So they used music, but then you could see the keys of the keyboard or of the piano, and then they used the black to be the white space. So there is no real white space, but they keep it very, very clean. All you need to know is date, time, location, how much it costs, how to contact you, and who's presenting, and that's it. So sometimes you have to let the now, luckily, you can understand it's a piano recital. You don't have to really tell somebody, oh, they're going to play this piece of music. But it's very interesting that they can get by with so little information. Sometimes we can try to get by with a little bit less information. Okay. This brings me to my favorite, or hold on. Yes, this brings me to my favorite element of design, which are fonts. I am a certifiable font nerd. I download fonts and install fonts on both my work computer and my home computer that I will never use. Just I want to have them, and I want to have that option to use them. And typography is a great way to kind of get across your idea. It's a way to breathe life into a flyer, into a brochure, because if you are not necessarily the most creative person out there, you don't want to necessarily hand draw everything you see, but you can let fonts do a lot of the work for you. So here Suzanne says, I read somewhere that libraries should pick 5 fonts and use them for everything. I think maybe parts of the library. One of the things that I try to emphasize is I stay away from the same fonts that the children's department uses. I'm the teen librarian at my library, and I try to stay away from the fonts that our adult programmer uses, because I tried to create a brand that's just about teens, and that you look at it and that's a teen program just based on the fonts I use. I typically, for any sort of information, I stick to very, very simple fonts. But I let my mind go wild when I use my fonts for the title of the program or the event that I'm using. I try to let my mind go crazy because I want that to have its own kind of identity. So it's almost like a brand in itself. But as far as information goes, so date, time, place, who can attend, that I try to stick to very simple fonts. So here, showing you what you can do with just font families alone. So Futura is a font family, and within that font family there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19 fonts. There are 19 separate fonts just in the Futura family alone. And so even by just using the Futura family, you can basically do an entire font or an entire brochure our entire flyer without ever looking too different. You can work it within font families very easily, uh, but what you should stick away from is having conflicting fonts. And so here was a demonstration that I used before. So the top font is Times New Roman. The bottom font is Georgia. They are too similar um, for them to be side by side. Our brain can tell the difference that they are different fonts, and then our brain does not like it. At least my brain doesn't like it. Some people might not even notice the difference. But these are different fonts. Um, it's very hard to tell. It's a little bit pixelated. But our you want to make sure that any font that you use, that you don't have conflicting fonts that are too similar. Okay? If you're going to use Times New Roman, use Times New Roman. That's fine. There's nothing wrong with Times New Roman. But don't put Georgia next to it. If you're going to use a separate font, use something completely different. Use sans serif, a sans serif font. So something like Open Sans. We'll talk about Open Sans here in a little bit. Or Arial Narrow. Those fonts you can use next to Times New Roman, and it will look different enough that people will be able to pick up the contrast. Okay? But try to stay away from two fonts that look really, really close. Before we go to contrast, because contrast is kind of a tying element for everything, I do want to show you some websites that work really well or that have, they're kind of repositories of fonts. I'm sure most of you have probably been to these kinds of websites, but I do want to just kind of show you what different elements that you need to be aware of. My fonts is, if you have a budget for fonts, awesome for you. I don't have a budget for fonts. I can't buy fonts. It would be awesome if I could buy a font family, because there are some really great fonts out there. The best fonts are almost always the paid, the fonts that you need to buy. There are some fonts in here that I think are free. There are free fonts on here because I've downloaded them before. But I do want you to, this is a good way to find maybe a font and then maybe try to find a lookalike font. If you have come across something that you have found and you don't know what the font is, My Fonts does have a neat feature called What the Font. Plus, they have a huge community that are basically typography nerds. But What the Font is a way that you can upload a photo of a font, and it will try to match the font as best as it can. So I have a really good eye for font. I can usually tell you what font it is by just looking at it. There are obviously things that you're going to find online and out and about that aren't necessarily going to work because they've been hand drawn or that they are fonts that somebody's made themselves. So they might not necessarily be on the internet. But if there is a font that you are trying to find and you don't want to sit and search forever to try to find it, this can get you maybe close to something similar. So it's a neat feature. But the free fonts are where most people are going to go. So there are 4 websites here I do want to show you. So there's thefonts.com, and they do have a lot of different options up here for you to choose from. So if you're looking for a decorative font, you click decorative, it's going to give you a lot of decorative fonts. The thing that we need to be aware is when it says free for personal use, then we have demos, and then sometimes you'll have free for commercial use, which, and you'll have donationware. Let's see, I'm looking for free for commercial use, and I'm not finding anything. Didn't mean to click that. Let's see. Some of the websites do have a button that you can click for free for find the commercial use. I do not. I've kind of gone back and forth with some people about whether or not personal use would constitute non-commercial use. Um, there's an FAQ here to find out. You're supposed to contact the person that has made the font. I have done that in the past, and usually most people have no problem. I've never had a problem with somebody saying, "Oh, I don't really want this to be used." When you tell them what the use is for, most of the time they're like, "That's fine, go ahead and use it." So just be aware that it's a good idea if it doesn't explicitly say for non-commercial use, that you should probably contact the person that's made the font, and it's fairly easy to do so. Each of these fonts have a person that has made said font. When you click it, you can send them a private message to see if the font is available for non-commercial use. Another website is 1001 Fonts. Once again, they are a little bit better about saying what this font is for personal use. This font is for commercial use. So you can use this font at all. You can use this font however you want to. It's a completely free font. So just be aware, once again, that there are there are barriers to using these fonts. So just be aware before you start using. Font Squirrel is another font website I've used in the past. Again, they're not as good about saying what fonts you can use and how you can use them. When you click on this font, it'll tell you can choose license, and it'll tell you what requirements you have, what licenses you have to use this font. So it says this font is protected by copyright law. And sometimes these fonts so it's 100% free for commercial use, but there are sometimes when I've clicked on a font from this website and then I have to pay for it. So you'll see here that these are 2 free fonts that you can use. But here, this is a font family that you have to start buying to get that font family. Should a simple flyer stick with one font family? That is completely up to you. I would never use more than 3 fonts for sure. I have used 3 fonts on a post or on a flyer or a poster before. Today, with infographics being the way they are, and the fact that that's how a lot of information gets distributed on social media, they utilize a lot of different fonts or hand drawn. You can get by with using a lot of fonts if it works well and they work well together. I try to stay away from doing that because I'm not that skilled with it. Let me show you a flyer here real quick that I've made before. And it's going to bring me kind of into contrast in a little bit and show you some of these tying elements. So I use the same font for this up here. This is Gotham. This is I'm being completely apolitical. This was the font that was used by the Obama campaign in 2008. When they used that font became like the most used font in the world. It seemed like everybody started using it. But this is that font. I use that font here. I also use that font down here as well. I wanted to stay with the same font. Now, as you can see here, this is a different font down here. I used this font when I created this overlay for the logo and everything that I have. I used one font that was very, very clean. Because this can work with basically any font that I put next to it. Because I just try to stick away from using the same kind of font. I stay away from Arial, Narrow, any font that looks like this. And then I used a different font for this because I was trying to replicate the logo for the Tonight Show with Jimmy Fallon. Because that was something that teens might recognize from watching on YouTube, because believe me, they watch more of that kind of stuff on YouTube than they watch on NBC or any television station. But I wanted to try to replicate that for my lock-in this past spring. And so I used a different font. I tried to find a similar font to the Tonight Show, and then I cut it out of the moon for negative space. So I use the same font for all the information except what you see at the bottom. So here there are technically 3 fonts going on, minus what you see in the logo. But because I used the same font here as I did here, it flows a lot better than, say, if I had used radically different fonts, and I wanted to make it look kind of balanced as well. I wanted the same font on top as I did here in the body. So when you purchase a font, are you allowed to use it for commercial or anything, or do you need to be careful about use? Like Yanni says here, it does depend on the license. In most cases, I believe that when you buy a font, when you purchase that font, you have right to use it for whatever. But there are tiered licenses. Sometimes when you purchase a font, it's telling you, oh, you have purchased this font for one computer for personal use. And that you can't transfer that license for that font onto other computers. So that's where you have to be very, very careful about purchasing a font. You need to read the fine text. Okay. Lastly, this is if you've never gone to Google Fonts, which is fonts.google.com, I highly suggest that you do. These fonts are, as far as I know, 100% free. These are fonts that either people at Google or people have created and let Google use. Google lets you download these and install them. Open Sans here was last time I read was the most adopted font of the last year. People are replacing a lot of what they're doing with Open Sans. Because it is a nice replacement to just about every font that I can think of Calibri and Times New Roman, because it's a very clean font and it's open source. So here you can adjust your categories. So say if you're looking for a handwriting font, you just choose handwriting and boom, you have all these handwriting fonts. And if you need to install it, so here I need to install Sacramento. I click this plus sign. It'll say one family selected. I can choose multiple fonts, but if I choose family selected, I can download it right now. Like that. So here's Sacramento, and I can install it. Okay. Some of these are families. They come with multiple fonts. Sometimes they're just one. So here we have 2 styles of Tangerine. There was 1 style to Sacramento. Sometimes there are more than 2 styles, okay? So here we can go. I need fonts with 9 styles or more. So here, Roboto has 12 styles. So there are 12 separate fonts within that font family, okay? All right. I think that brings me to the end of fonts. If you have any questions about fonts, did you mention that? Yes, they are available for commercial use. So do not be afraid to use the fonts on Google for anything. So if you download those fonts, you can use them on any flyer, brochure, and you don't have to worry about the rights or licensing behind it. Okay. And last time I checked, there was like 800 separate font families up there. So that is considerably more than what you get on Windows. When you get Windows, you only have about 150 fonts roughly. If you download every font on Google, you're going to get something close to 800 from them. Okay. Let's see. So contrast. Contrast is a principle that kind of goes in line with texture font, color, you're going to find contrast invades everything. And because we are information scientists, we love contrast because it's a way for us to place stress on certain things. So contrast aids the organization of information in a small space. It applies to color, fonts, and textures. So here, talking about text in particular, because we want legibility and we want it not to hurt people's eyes. You can see here that, say, white text on a blue background, pretty easy to read. But as brightness goes down, it becomes harder to read, and you make it more of a test of someone's eyesight. So you want to make sure that your text is bright or is obviously, if you have a dark background, you want bright text. If you have a bright background, you want dark text. It's not rocket science in that regard. Complementary colors work. So here, yellow text on a blue background works. Blue text on a yellow background works. You don't want colors that are adjacent to each other, though. You don't want green text on an orange background. That's the reason I never have cared for the brown and orange color scheme that we were given, because brown text on an orange background, it is brutal. So just be aware of what is legible. And this is a good place for me to say that what is sometimes legible on a computer screen might not necessarily be legible when you print it off. So play around with your settings on your printer, and also just be aware that you need to, while you're making something for electronic sources, you also need to be making something for print sources. And there's also color blindness to be aware. Don't ever put red and green together. I've once had a disagreement with some people about when it came to be Christmas time, they were using green text on red background, and I was like, people aren't going to be able to read this. So be aware that is there a website to test that? There is a website to test that contrast, but I cannot remember. I'm certain a Google search could probably provide an answer. For images. So I don't know of a website, but let me do some research. If you, what I'll do is maybe put up something for everyone. Is there a way? Hopefully, there's a way for me to contact everyone that's watching this and see if I can send something forward. I'll do some research and see if I can find something for everyone.
This is Courtney here. Yes, if you get that to me, I can send it in an email to everyone who's attended.
Awesome. Thank you. So I'll do some research. We're all busy. I'll take that. It's a good test of my reference skills. Also, here on the right-hand side, there's a color contrast visibility chart. So if you see here, like, black works really well with bright colors, like your warm colors that we think of are bright, warm colors. So yellow, orange. But you don't want to put blue on black, and you don't want to put green on black. Okay. So just be aware that this is a good way for you to maybe test and see what looks good. Okay. Contrast also works with size. So obviously we know, make your title of your program really big on your flyers, and make your library, the name of your library on your brochures big, because you want people to be able to see them. So that is a form of contrast, is dignifying what information is important, be big, what information is a little bit less important, be small. Down here at the bottom is the logo for my now defunct Anime Society. I try to emphasize contrast not only with size, so society is a little bit smaller than anime because I wanted people to see anime. So I'm a teen librarian. I wanted my teens to see anime and get excited. Um, and so I utilized images from different anime into the logo, but I emphasized contrast with the type of font that I use. So I went from a very clean font for the anime to a more handwritten font for the society. Um, and rather than making more contrast issues with, so I went with a bright pink because the pink pops out and it kind of sets itself apart from everything in the background. Um, so that's how contrast can all work together as far as font, size, texture, even, and then color as well. Okay. So when you create things, just be aware that you want it to be completely legible, but also to be. How did I get the anime characters to become part of the font? That is a good question for next week because I'll show something very similar to how I did that in GIMP, because that's how I did it. Um, so that brings me to resolution, and I know we're getting really close on time. We've got about 4 minutes, so let me get through resolutions, and then I'll put up my contact info and I'll be more than happy to answer any questions anybody has. Um, so when before you even start your design, and this is always horrible to say because it's the end of the presentation, um, think about where you're going to display this design. You don't want to like make a flyer and then be like, I need to make this into a brochure because your dimensions change. Okay. So here, think about what you're displaying things as, and then design based on that. Um, so if you're going to display this on an HD TV, your dimensions are going to be different. Is this going to be a print flyer? Your dimensions are going to be different. Um, is it a 4x3 photo frame, or are you putting this only on social media? These are all different aspect ratios that we have to be aware of. Um, so here I took a flyer that I made a few years ago with Grumpy Cat when Grumpy Cat was still a thing. Um, so here on the left hand side is the original print flyer I made. Obviously, you can see this is like why you need to sometimes use different fonts. I use the same font for my title as I did for everything else, and it's hard to read. Um, so the next time I have an anti-Valentine's Day party, I'm going to make sure I change that because I want it to be a little bit easier to read. Okay. Um, so if you take a design that was meant simply for print and then you display it on a 16 by 9 HD TV, you're either going to get one of two things. You're going to get black bars on the sides because you're taking something that's 8.5 by 11 and displaying on something 16 by 9, or it's going to stretch it out, and now Grumpy Cat looks even more grumpy because now he looks like he got, I don't know, compressed somehow. And plus, this is a no-no at my library because we have rules about what we can do to the logo of our library, and you do not want to mess with this. Okay? If you demonstrate, if you display your logo and you stretch it out like that, it shows that you don't care about how your library is represented. Okay? So you need to take things like this into account, that you don't want to stretch out the logo of the institution you're representing. Okay? Um, so just be aware where you're displaying your information at, and then make the design based on that. There's ways of adapting it. We'll talk about that on Canva. There's easier ways to stretch things out, and I'll also talk about that next week during GIMP. So here was I took the same flyer, and then this is it demonstrated on a 4x3 uh, photo frame. So you notice that there's almost no difference. because the differences are so slight, but they are differences nonetheless. So if you have very explicit rules, or um, if you have somebody like me as your boss, you might want to be aware that you need to create a different version of your flyer or for a 4x3 screen. Okay. Um, so this is a lot of information. I'm sorry to display it so quickly, but these are the aspects that I work with. When I create a flyer that's landscape letter, I make it 3300 by 2550 in pixels. I always make everything bigger than it needs to be, because you never know when you need to display something or make a bigger version of it. So this thing could be printed off as like a giant poster, um, but I make everything as big as I possibly can because it's easier to work with that way. Um, I can send those resolutions to you. I'm gonna find out the color blindness, if there's a website for color blindness, a test or something for a flyer, and then I will give this to I'll give this to the state library. They can figure out what to do with it and send it out to you guys. Um, but very quickly, my contact info is right here. So you are more than welcome to send flyers to me, to send me questions, or if you have a flyer and you just want some quick tips or anything for me, you can forward that to me or send that to me at my email address. So it's mstephenson@pendleton.lib.in.us. And I know if you get me when I'm not busy, which you know depends because I work with teens, you can call me, and I'm usually pretty